might be very uncomfortable for me.
So Chara's British.
Half British. One half is British. Oh, jeez.
I'm half Asian. I don't mind making fun of Asians or talking real about it. And I'm half white. I don't mind talking real about whiteness.
Okay.
You know,
Right.
I don't mind like pointing out the flaws of the white.
I understand that the white has a lot of flaws.
But they won't admit that. I know I don't. I'm just kidding. Okay. Hello people, I'm JABY KOAY. This is Achar Kirk. And we are going to look at Dr. Shashi Tharoor, MP, Britain does owe reparations. Now, I want to preface this with saying that some fan asked me to look at this video, and I wasn't sure if I should or not. So I put it out on Twitter and I said, if this gets 500 likes, I will look at the video and I will review it. I've never seen 500 likes show up so goddamn fast. I'm like, people really want me to watch this. So here we go. Let's check this out.
President, and gentlemen, ladies of the House, standing here with 8 minutes in my hands and at this venerable and rather magnificent institution, I was going to assure you that I belong to the Henry VIII School of Public Speaking. That as Henry VIII said to his wives, I shall not keep you long. But now finding myself...
Oh shit, I'm sorry.
But now finding myself the 7th speaker out of 8 in what must already seem a rather long evening to you, I rather feel like Henry VIII's last wife. I more or less know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure how to do it any differently. Perhaps what I should do is really try and pay attention to the arguments that were advanced by the opposition today. We had, for example, Sir Richard Ottery suggesting, challenging the very idea that it could be argued that the economic situation of the colonies was actually worsened by the experience of British colonialism. Well, I stand to offer you the Indian example, Sir Richard. India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%.
Wow.
Why? Simply because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's industrial revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer, went from having 27% of world trade to less than 2%.
Oh my God.
Meanwhile, colonialists like Robert Clive bought their rotten boroughs in England on the proceeds of their loot in India, while taking the Hindi word loot into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to the country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of the country belonged to him. By the end of the 19th century, the fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression. And as has been pointed out, the wealthy Victorian British families that made their money out of the slave economy, 1/5 of the elites of the wealthy class in Britain in the 19th century owed their money to transporting 3 million Africans across the waters. And in fact, in 1833, when slavery was abolished, what happened was that a compensation of £20 million was paid, not as reparations to those who had lost their lives or who had suffered or been oppressed by slavery, but to those who had lost their property. I was struck by the fact that your Wi-Fi password of this union commemorates the name of Mr. Gladstone, the great liberal hero. Well, I'm sorry, his family was one of those who benefited from this compensation.
Wow. Look at Christopher Columbus.
Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines. The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, when 4 million people died because Winston Churchill deliberately, as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal to sturdy Tommies and Europeans as reserve stockpiles. He said that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered much less than that of sturdy Greeks. This is Churchill's actual quote. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him, pointing out that people were dying because of this decision, he peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" So all notions that the British were trying to do their colonial enterprise out of enlightened despotism to try and bring the benefits of colonialism and civilization to the benighted heathen. I'm sorry, Churchill's conduct in 43 simply one example of many that gave a lie to this myth. As others have said on the proposition, violence and racism were the reality of the colonial experience. And no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark. Let me take World War I as a very concrete example, since the first speaker, Mr. Lee, suggested these things couldn't be quantified. Well, let me quantify World War I for you. Again, I'm sorry, from an Indian perspective, others have spoken of other countries. 1/6 of all the British forces that fought in the war were Indian.
Whoa.
54,000 Indians actually lost their lives in that war.
Wow.
65,000 were wounded, another 4,000 remained missing or in prison. Indian taxpayers had to cough up £100 million in that time's money.
What?
India supplied 70 million rounds of ammunition, 600,000 rifles and machine guns, 42 million garments were stitched and sent out of India, and 1.3 million Indian personnel served in this war. I know all this because, of course, the commemoration of the centenary has just taken place. But not just that, India had to supply 173,000 animals, 370 million tons of supplies, and in the end, the total value of everything that was taken out of India, India, by the way, suffering from recession at that time and poverty and hunger, was, in today's money, £8 billion. You want quantification? Wow. It's available. Second World War, wow. It was even worse, 2.5 million Indians in uniform. I won't belabor the point, but of Britain's total war debt of £3 billion, in 1945 money, 1.25 billion was owed to India and never actually paid. Somebody mentioned Scotland. Well, the fact is that colonialism actually cemented your union with Scotland. You know, the Scots had actually tried to send colonies out before 1707. They'd all failed, I'm sorry to say. But then, of course, came union, and India was available, and there you had a disproportionate employment of Scots. I'm sorry, Mr. Mackenzie has to speak after me. Engaged in this colonial enterprise as soldiers, as merchants, as agents, as employees, and the earnings from India is what brought prosperity to Scotland, even pulled Scotland out of poverty. Now that India is no longer there, no wonder the bonds are loosening. Now, we've heard other arguments on this side. There's been a mention of the railways. Well, let me tell you, first of all, as my colleague, the Jamaican High Commissioner, has pointed out, railways and roads were really built to serve British interests and not those of the local people. But I might add that many countries have built railways and roads without having had to be colonized in order to do so. They were designed to carry raw materials from the hinterland into the ports to be shipped to Britain. And the fact is that the Indian or Jamaican or other colonial public, their needs were incidental. Transportation, there was no attempt made to match supply to demand for mass transport, none whatsoever. Instead, in fact, the Indian railways were built with massive incentives offered by Britain to British investors, guaranteed out of Indian taxes paid by Indians, with the result that you actually had 1 mile of Indian railway costing twice what it cost to build the same mile in Canada or Australia, because there was so much money being paid in extravagant returns. Britain made all the profits, controlled the technology, supplied all the equipment, and absolutely all these benefits came as private enterprise, British private enterprise, at public risk, Indian public risk. That was the railways as an accomplishment. We're hearing about aid. I think it was again, Sir Richard Ottaway mentioned British aid to India. Well, let me just point out that British aid to India is about 0.4% of India's GDP. The government of India actually spends more on fertilizer subsidies, which might be an appropriate metaphor for that argument.
Wow.
If I may point out as well.
Damn.
If I may point out as well that that as my fellow speakers from the proposition have pointed out, there have been incidents of racial violence, of loot, of massacres, of bloodshed, of transportation, in India's case, even of one of our last Mughal emperor. Yes, maybe today's Britons are not responsible for some of these depredations, but the same speakers have pointed with pride to their foreign aid. You're not responsible for the people starving in Somalia, but you give them aid. Surely the principle of reparations for the wrongs that have been done cannot be denied. It's been pointed out, for example, the dehumanization of Africans in the Caribbean, the massive psychological damage that has been done, the undermining of social traditions, of property rights, of the authority structures of these societies, all in the interests of British colonialism. And the fact remains that many of today's problems in these countries, including the persistence, in some cases the creation of racial and ethnic and religious tensions, were the direct result of the colonial experience. So there is a moral debt that needs to be paid. Someone challenged reparations elsewhere. Well, I'm sorry, Germany doesn't just give reparations to Israel. It also gave reparations to Poland. Perhaps some of the speakers here are too young to remember the dramatic picture of Chancellor Willy Brandt on his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970. And there are other examples. There is Italy's reparations to Libya. There's Japan's to Korea. Even Britain has paid reparations to the New Zealand Maoris. So it's not as if this is something unprecedented or unheard of that's going to somehow open some sort of nasty Pandora's box. No wonder Professor Lewis reminded us that he's from Texas. There's a wonderful expression in Texas that summarizes the arguments of the opposition: all hat and no cattle. Now, if I can just quickly look through the other notes I was scribbling while they were speaking, there was reference to democracy and rule of law. Let me say with the greatest possible respect, it's a bit rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, maim people for 200 years and then celebrate the fact that they're democratic at the end of it. We were denied democracy, sir. We had to snatch it, seize it from you. With the greatest reluctance, it was conceded in India's case after 150 years of British rule, and that too with limited franchise. Yes, indeed, ma'am.
The opposition spoke quite highly of Greek and Athenian democracy on which the West should pride itself, and spoke of liberty and equality in that same name. The Athenian democracy was only functioning because of the slave society on which it was built. That's the nature of colonisation.
All right, I don't think that needs contradiction, not from me at any rate. but if I may just point out, I think the argument made by a couple of the speakers, the first speaker, Mr. Lee in particular, conceded all the evil atrocities of colonialism, but essentially suggested that reparations won't really help. They won't help the right people. They'll be used as a propaganda tool. They'll embolden people like Mr. Mugabe. It's always nice how in the old days, I'm sorry to say that the people of the Caribbean used to frighten their children into behaving and sleeping by saying Sir Francis Drake would come after them. That was a legacy of that. Now it's Mugabe will be there. So this is the new sort of Sir Francis Drake of our times. The fact is very simply, sir, that we are not talking about reparations as a tool to empower anybody. They're a tool for you to atone for the wrongs that have been done. And I am quite prepared to accept the proposition that you can't put a monetary sum on the kinds of horrors people have suffered. Certainly no amount of money can expiate the loss of a loved one, as somebody pointed out there. You're not going to be able to figure out an exact amount, but the principle is what matters. The fact is that to speak blithely of sacrifices on both sides, as an analogy was used here, a burglar comes into your house, ransacks the place, stubs his toe, and you say, well, there was a sacrifice on both sides. That, I'm sorry to say, is not an acceptable argument. The truth is that we are not arguing specifically that vast sums of money need to be paid. The proposition before this House is the principle of owing reparations, not the fine points of how much is owed, to whom it should be paid. The question is there a debt? Does Britain owe reparations? As far as I'm concerned, the ability to acknowledge a wrong that has been done, to simply say sorry, will go a far, far, far longer way than some percentage of GDP in the form of aid. What is required, it seems to me, is accepting the principle that reparations are owed. Personally, I'd be quite happy if it was £1 a year for the next 200 years after the last 200 years of Britain and India. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Wow.
Wow, yeah. Well, he was a very, very eloquent speaker.
Yeah.
He presented his case very well, I thought.
So I have to take for granted that everything he's saying is accurate, and because I haven't researched any of this stuff, this is all largely new information to me. And of course, easily what it reminds me of, thinking of homeland, is what African Americans have gone through.
I'm gonna say Native Americans.
Or Native Americans as well.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people have suffered at the hand of the white man, so I get it. I am ready to believe that in a heartbeat, and I didn't realize to what degree damage had been done to India by Britain.
Yeah, I'm British, right?
Yeah.
Half British, but I'm gonna be like, I'm half. But
The better half's over here. The better half's on YouTube.
no, but in all seriousness, a lot of atrocious stuff happened. A lot of greed. It's not pleasant analyzing the past and being like, that's a part of my history as well. And it made me question my grandparents. My dad's parents actually spent a lot of time in India and Africa, and they were civil servants. So hearing him speak about civil servants and what they were doing in India and stuff like that, it makes me feel maybe just a little bit uncomfortable with my own personal history.
Hearing all that information makes me kind of nauseous, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, I get sick hearing all that stuff. I'm just like, I don't even know how to respond to it. It's just, that's fucked up. That's all I can think is like, wow, that's really messed up. And I don't know what to do with that information. That's really sad. And when he explained the numbers on how many Indians were involved in Britain's wars.
Yeah. I didn't even know that.
I'm like, well, this is again assuming that everything he's saying is indeed accurate, because I haven't fact-checked anything he said. But I have to just assume that what he's saying is indeed accurate.
I would say it probably is, because if you're fighting a war, how are you going to find more people from the colonies?
Right. Yeah.
That's the easiest way to find people.
True that. No, that's true. And that just really makes me sad to hear that. It's like, okay, so you involved a bunch of Indians in your war, a war they didn't need to necessarily fight in.
No.
And you fucked up their country, and then you don't pay them reparations for fighting your war. That's so just upsetting. And it's like, I don't even know how to that's so disgusting to me. How can you do that? That's like...
Well, I think I agree with his main point being that it's not the amount, it's acknowledging that you did something wrong and apologizing for it first and foremost, and then the money.
To me, I'm the opposite.
Really?
I'm the complete opposite. Reparations. You don't ever have to fucking apologize to me, but pay me my fucking reparations, yo. Pay me my reparations, bitch. Like that. Don't ever apologize to me. I don't give a shit. My pride's not that fucking shallow. But you pay me reparations because the thing is, like, you have to think that there's a lot of people. The way I look at it, I keep going back to this, but the way I look at it is over here in the States, where people go, well, you know, African Americans are killing other African Americans, and they're not, you know, choosing a better education and blah blah blah. And it's like, well, look here, motherfucker. Okay, you have to also consider the fact that they were not brought up the way you were brought up, Mr. White Guy, because their parents were poor, and those parents were poor because when slavery ended, shit wasn't just hunky-dory. It was fucked up for black people for a long time, and what could they pass on? They didn't have a house to pass on. They had fear and frustration to pass on. And so it's like, I completely respect when black people are frustrated about the long history that's led to today. And so likewise, Indians are affected today by that injustice, you know? And so I don't give a shit about apologies. I care about them paying up to do something to kind of compensate for how many years, how many decades has it been that this fallout has taken place now, and British people haven't stepped up to go, okay, let's help, you know, mend our wrongs here, you know, and pay back what we owe. And it's like,
but how do you quantify that?
He quantified it in numbers there, and then you add interest, just like a credit card company would do.
All right.
You know, okay, well, here's how much money Britain took from India. Now you add 25% interest to that, because that's what a credit card company would do to you, or whatever it is you want. Like, sure, it's not going to make up for the lives lost. It's not going to make up for the suffering, but going forward, if it's given to the right people in India, and Indians are able to use that properly and distribute that money properly to educate their people and help raise the economy and you know, do everything right with infrastructure and all that stuff, then the next 80 years is going to look so much better than the last 80 years. That's my opinion on it. You know what I mean? But this is coming from a guy who doesn't know politics that well, who doesn't know history that well, who doesn't know enough about it, let alone Indian history and British history that well. So this is just my opinion off of what this guy's saying, assuming everything he's saying is indeed true and accurate. He had a lot of information on those little pieces of paper, man.
Yeah, I was like, how did he even read them? Yeah. He wasn't even wearing his glasses. He had those little, like, magnetic ones.
I have to assume that he has had he has had a conversation about that particular topic, those topics, many a time.
Well, these are people who are professional debaters.
Right.
Yeah, he's gonna be on point.
Yeah. So this was very educational for me.
Yeah, very enlightening and uncomfortable, but very educational.
At some point, so okay, did you watch the AIB British and India thing? Okay.
No. So
we're gonna conclude on this. If you guys, I would love to hear comments about what we discussed, and not just suggestions for other things to react to.
Yeah.
So please
don't hate me because I'm half British.
Yeah. So yeah, I would love to hear comments on that and maybe kind of educating us some more.
Yes, please.
And in addition to that comment, in the same paragraph or whatever, in the same sentence, also let us know if you want Achara to watch AIB's British in India.
Was it The Day India Resigned?
The Day India Resigned, that's what it's called. So if you want Achara to watch that, it can be her solo video because I already watched it. Let us know in the comments. But don't just say that. Comment on the conversation we had as well.
Yes, please. I would love to gain more information from you guys about how you feel about this. Yeah, I'd just be so interested to know more.
All right, you guys, thanks so much for hanging out with us. Please check out Achara Kirk on the social media. Subscribe to the channel. Check out other reactions, reviews, short films, video game-related videos. I am depressed. God damn. All right, you guys. I'm not depressed. We'll be okay. We'll get through this. We'll get through this, y'all.
It's okay.
I'm JABY KOAY. This is
Achara Kirk.
Peace out.